Made possible through support from ARC Thrift Stores, Colorado District Attorney's Council, Developmental Pathways, and the ARC of Aurora. A THINK+change training.
Hello, everyone out there in the internet worlds, or however you found us. Welcome to our next edition of the THINK+change and ARC of Aurora vodcast podcast series. This series, we're going to focus specifically on human rights and how do they relate with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We will be primarily focusing on adults, though when we talk initially in this episode, you'll better understand just basic human and civil rights that you can expect as a human that walks this earth, right? We want to really talk a lot about how we all engage in utilizing our rights and how that might look a little different for folks who utilize IDD services. So I am joined here today by the fabulous advocacy team with the ARC of Aurora. Got Petrie Brill, Jeff Vernengel, Tom Walsh, as well as Anna Cafaro. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, team, for joining me today. And really, I want to kick it off quick. Let's talk human rights. Tom, what can you tell us about human rights? How does it impact us as we kind of navigate the community?
Thanks, Honey. So human rights are a little bit different than some other rights that you might have heard of before, specifically civil rights and things like that. But really what it comes down to is human rights are the rights we have simply because we exist as human beings. We're all born with these universal rights, regardless of any nationality, sex, ethnic origin, color, religion, language, disability, or really any other status. And they cover such big things such as just the right to life, as well as those little things that make life worth living, such as the right to food, education, work, health, liberty, anything really to where you can benefit yourself and work towards your goals.
Very cool. Well, and Anna, do human rights differ, or how do they relate to like civil rights or, your political rights as a human?
Right. So as Tom said, human rights you have because you're human. And what we call civil or political rights are the ones that we have because we're a citizen of a country. And those countries have made these rules to protect those human rights. Mm-hmm. And for example, in our country, we have the Constitution, and that protects some of those rights that, Tom was talking about. Unfortunately, sometimes those rights are not equally enjoyed by everyone in our country. So we've got to make some more rules and some more laws to protect those rights. So hence the Civil Rights Act that protected discrimination based on race and gender and many other things. And then in our community, in the disability community, we have the ADA, or the American with Disabilities Act, that protects our community from being discriminated against and protects their right to enjoy or these civil rights that we were talking about.
So the ADA kind of levels the playing field for people with disabilities?
Yeah.
Well, it makes sure that everyone that has a disability has equal access to these rights that are given to us for being American citizens, and that we cannot be discriminated based on that disability.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Well, thank you guys for kind of grounding us in like the inalienable rights, right? The things that we just get because of, the place we live or, of the status of being a human. But I do know that in the intellectual and developmental disability world, and specifically with some of the home and community-based waivers, that there are some interesting kind of tweaks to what those rights could look like in application. So I don't know, Jeff, do you have any ideas around, are there systems that actually suspend or remove rights from people with developmental disabilities?
Yes, yes, there is. In Colorado, the rights of an adult with intellectual and developmental disabilities, if they're enrolled in an HCBS waiver, which stands for Home and Community-Based Services. But anyway, if they're enrolled in that waiver, their rights could be restricted, removed, or even suspended. So to answer your question flat out, yes, but we call it in the world of disability, we call it rights modifications. But there is a process in place to modify these rights, and it's done on an individualized basis. It's not like someone has this disability, so they lose this right. It's based on the individual and the circumstance. So the circumstance, it really depends, but mostly it's a situation that you need to protect the individual from endangering themselves or their housemates, and in some cases property, but it's mostly focused on endangering oneself or housemates. And the procedure, there is a procedure for this. It's not like someone just says, no more, you can't do that. No, there is a procedure. The right modification is proposed to the IDT team, which IDT stands for interdisciplinary team.
Thank you.
So that's a group of support staff that work with that individual. Now, that right modification, it also needs to be documented in the service plan of that individual. And there has to be a plan to remove that rights modification. It can't be like, this is forever something that we're going to restrict for me. So it has to have a plan to remove the restrictions, and it's reviewed by that same IDT team at least every 6 months. It can be reviewed even more frequently, but it has to be reviewed every 6 months. And then there's a third level safeguard in rights restriction or modification process. And that's something called the Human Rights Committee, also called the HRC. So once again, they're a third party safeguard, and they're there to review these modifications, right modifications, to make sure that the client is being treated fair and it's, client based. And this same HRC also reviews psychotropic medication because that's something that modifies someone's behavior. And we don't want people doping people up just to get rid of behaviors, because everyone has the right to be who they really are.
For sure. Yeah, you hear a lot about that, building in some of these rights restrictions or suspensions, whether it's through, let's say not accessing a lot of alone time in the community, or restrictions on the amount of time you can spend on the internet or with your cell phone.
Right.
As well as psychotropics, right? That it's like that balance between health and safety for adults on the super specific waiver, right? With, kind of dignity of risk, as well as, provider convenience, right? We don't want to be in a place where we are restricting someone's rights just because it's easier for all the rest of us to manage. So I really appreciate, Jeff. I mean, it's really around health and safety and the wellness of that individual versus, what works for the system, air quote, for those of you listening on the podcast.
Great. And if you want to know more about the process too, you can always reach out. If you have an advocate, reach out to your advocate. If you have a case manager, they should be able to explain this process to you. And if they can't, they need to get their supervisor to help explain, because this is something that's real and it's out there, and everyone deserves to know how the system works. But I just kind of gave you a nutshell.
Yeah, or anyone else really. So if I have a disability, does that mean my rights could be restricted or suspended or modified?
Yes.
It could. If I'm using one waiver, right?
Right.
And that's the, that DD waiver, the Developmental Disability Waiver, because not across the world of disability and that full spectrum, there aren't some of these similar functions for all people. And so knowing, when you're walking into either as a professional or an individual or family, what does the provider or that system have the authority to even do? Because I think we see a lot in the advocacy world that people's rights are restricted or modified when it's, first of all, inappropriate, right? Based on the person or the issue. But the system doesn't have the authority to be doing what they're proposing or what they have been doing.
And I think it's one of those things too, where it's really important to, especially as advocates, we may come into a situation where rights modification is in place and nobody can really tell us why.
Yeah.
And it's really important to constantly have open eyes and be curious and ask the really important questions that are going to protect these people's rights A lot of it, as you know, you mentioned, Hani, is based on convenience. A lot of it is based on worry that something will happen as opposed to something that has actually happened in the past. Like maybe just an example of that is a pretty common rights restriction that we see as advocates is a sharps restriction, which means, you know, people don't have access to knives or scissors or sticks, you know, what I mean, it's kind of a broad spectrum.
Yeah.
And that is because potentially maybe they've had cutting issues in the past or they've harmed themselves. But we see a lot of times this modification in place because a person might hurt themselves down the road or the team is worried that they might. And that is absolute inappropriate use of a rights modification. You know, the thinking is to protect someone from themselves. And while we understand, you know, the desire to protect individuals, that's just absolutely inappropriate. And it's putting restrictions on people for things that they haven't done. And it doesn't allow them to live, you know, their full life.
Totally.
And if I can add something, in my opinion, one of the most important parts of these rights modifications is the plan to lift the restriction.
Absolutely.
Because that's not a solution. It's supposed to be something that the team works on to get the individual to not have that restriction anymore. I mean, there's some things that are a little bit out of people's control, but most of these, it's really important, I guess I'm just saying, to have that plan to get off the restriction.
And that plan, Jeff, I'm glad you said that because
or modification.
Yeah, because that plan needs to be very specific and it needs to be measured at certain time increments. And then feedback needs to be given to the individual to say, here's where you are in this path to restoration of your rights. Here are some things that you still need to specifically do. Here's some things you're doing really well. Always great to highlight the good things as well. I think that's super important.
Yeah.
And, you know, that path then gives them something to work towards. It allows for teachable moments. And it just doesn't feel then to the individual like this restriction now is in a vacuum. Why bother even trying? Because this is going to go on forever. So it does give them, you know, some light at the end of the tunnel and something to work towards with the support of the team. We can't just expect, you know, the individual for us to say, here's your path back to your rights. Now, good luck. It really a lot of team support around that. So that's also a really important piece of that path back to restoration.
I think it's important to note too that this should never happen without an individual's prior notice and written consent. And kind of what Petrie and Jeff were talking about, this plan to lift that modification should be included in that informed consent form so that the individual understands that it is a temporary modification in place with the end goal of lifting it. So it should never be done as a surprise, and the individual should always be working with the team to implement this modification.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and we're going to talk more about that in more detail, Tom, in our next video. So I'm glad you gave a little teaser for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think too, it's important, you know, from an advocacy perspective or anyone else out there in the real world, right, to look at those plans for restoration of the rights or whatever you're looking at and make sure that they're attainable.
Right.
And so often, you know, the path that a person with an intellectual or developmental disability has to walk in order to, you know, receive, you know, their community time back that's unsupervised is not attainable because we don't give a chance to people to attain those goals. And so really looking at those, whether they're built into behavior plans or whether they're built into that modification plan, making sure that, you know, first of all, there's an opportunity for the folks that need or perhaps require this based on that team decision, have the opportunity to practice building the skill in a safe way, right? We so often see that people or teams try to, you know, release some of that right or inch closer to restoration. And if there's a failure, then the whole system kind of just closes back up on itself. It's like, see, I told you this wasn't going to work. But really, we know, you know, as humans, that experience is typically the best way that we're going to learn or be successful traversing or navigating the community. And so We suggest from an advocacy perspective to give people the room to practice and experience and maybe fail, because failures often lead us towards better understanding of the way we want to be successful with a system or a community.
And,
so we talked a little, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, really, just kind of highlighting that is okay. Those, if you take 4 steps forward and 2 steps back, that's okay. And making sure that punitive measures aren't really taken when those kinds of things occur. Because as you said, this is how people learn. All humans learn from mistakes, and it's important for them to have the opportunity to fail and to succeed, both in equal measure.
You got it. And it kind of flips the, service world on its head, because so often we think about kind of this progress towards goals in more of a medical model or rehabilitation, or right, like we can collect data on improvements, right? But this is not physical therapy. This is learning skill sets. And we all, over the course of our lives, learn new things, the more experience we get, right? And so when we look at it more as a community-based model versus a medical model, it gives certainly me an opportunity to think about it a little bit differently, right? Yeah. This is not, if these 4, things have been met, then we'll consider it successful. This is an ever-evolving progress towards goal acquisition and experience in our lives. So we've talked a little bit about how we look at these rights. We can also be protected to make sure, certainly for folks with IDD, are protected when I say the community or service providers look to revoke or manage, modify those rights. But I just wanted to put a little plug into that. While all of these things are built in and we've got systems of support, it still fails, right? And so we want listeners or viewers to know also that if ever you feel like your basic human or civil rights are being not respected or taken away from you in any setting, this is not just because you have a disability and you're using the DD waiver, that you can always use the Office of Civil Rights. It's a statewide organization that you can provide, either get some technical assistance to have a better idea of, is this really a modification to my right? Are people treating me not nicely or not fairly? And if, to be honest, if it is happening, you could file a complaint that allows for other people to go investigate that and support you. Outside of that, if you are in that DD waiver, if you do have a developmental disability, you can look at discussing with the Human Rights Committee challenges around, like Tom mentioned, the consent and informed consent. If you don't consent to a rights modification, your service provider is not allowed to implement it, right? There's a few technical differences, especially when it's like an emergency issue, right? When they call it an emergency control procedure, where it would be unfair and inappropriate for a service provider to either allow a behavior that could actually get you hurt or have other folks get hurt. So there's a little loophole, but most things like access to your cell phone is not an emergency control procedure, right? And so just know that there are those same layers that help review rights modifications are also the places you can go back to if you feel like your rights are not being respected. So you've got HRC, you could also talk with your case manager. There's also a CCB, so Community Centered Board, that's where your case manager comes from usually. There's also, a CCB complaint process as well. So you've got a couple different layers to help support you if you feel like your rights are being taken away unnecessarily. And always find your local ARC chapter too. I mean, we are certainly happy in Aurora to help you navigate what that looks like, or restoration, or making sure, you have the same community access that you should expect from your peers and your neighbors as well. Did I miss anything, you guys? Is there anything else? I know we're going to talk in episode 2 more around what the final settings rule does and as it relates to rights for people with disabilities. But did I miss anything on kind of our general overview? What are rights?
No, I think we kind of hit all the highlights.
Awesome. Well, thank you, team, for joining me. I'll see you on episode 2. And for everyone out there listening or watching, keep following along. We've got next episode is our all around final settings. And then our third one is actually an interview with a professional in the field. So we will see you soon. Take care.
THINK+change. Talks, trainings, and tools to help in your work for or with people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. Learn more at www.thinkchange.training.